Devasso.
Back in the distant past, way back, like when rock and roll was just rock, and fast food was dinner you couldn't catch, lived two cave dudes named Joe and Mac. Whether it was dinosaur demolition derbies, Tyrannosaurus Rex, or pterodactyl hang gliding, peak in the beak, life for the boys was pretty cool. Cool, that is, until a bogus bunch of Neanderthal nerds crashed their village and scared off all the cave babes. Neanderthals still hadn't discovered toothpaste. Phew! Now all the cave babes are out there somewhere, lost and lonely. It's up to Joe and Mac to get them back. That intro makes a weird amount more sense with the subtitle that the original arcade release had, which was Caveman Ninja, Joe and Mac. God, that's 90s. Hello everyone and welcome to Let's Play Joe and Mac. This is the Super Nintendo version in specific, because this was one of those arcade games that got ports to a lot of consoles at the era. Control-wise, there's not a lot to note about Joe and Mac. D-pad's pretty obvious. The L and R buttons can be held to sprint, which is noticeably faster, but not exactly useful. The other two controls are two of your face buttons are jumping, two of them are attacking. Which ones are which are technically customizable in the options menu, but that's about it. We're playing on normal mode, because all that it changes is the amount of HP enemies have, and it doesn't change the ending whatsoever. So, other things to note. For one thing, any enemy in the game, barring boss fights of course, you can actively stand on top of and use them as platforms like I used to get to that egg a moment ago. Eggs? What they contain is technically random on the whole. They are largely, though, where you get either meat, which is your health pickups if you take damage. Your health is noted by the hearts next to your name, Joe or Mac, depending on if you're player 1 or player 2 respectively. And even though that's 5 hearts, it's not 5 hits, it's actually closer to 10, because each heart can be divided in half a la Zelda 1. Another control thing to note is that you have a dash that's different from your sprint. If you double tap the D-pad left or right, you dash forward in a bit of a rolling animation, and that same rolling animation can be used to do a somersault jump by holding up and pressing the jump button, which is much higher in how high it goes. Now, that egg I just broke a moment ago was red. There's one of those in a lot of the game's various stages, and if you break them when there's no enemies on screen, or if you've touched a certain part of the stage beforehand, a purple pterodactyl hatches out of it, which will take you over to a little bonus area, which will usually have some healing items, some 1-ups, some of the weapons you can get in the game, or a key a lot of the time as well. Keys are used to open up bonus stages that are locked on the world map screen, because you actively do move around on the world map like in Super Mario Bros. 3, for instance. Now, I've collected a couple of weapons already. By default, you just have your club, which doesn't do a lot of damage, but I've collected the stone throwing and the fireball attack. Stone's throw has very high area of effect, and it goes pretty far forward, but it does eventually drop down. You can use that to actively hit enemies below you. And the fire also has that drop down, but when it actively lands on the ground, it leaves fire behind that does a lot of damage. The fire that it leaves behind on top of one other weapon are actually the strongest weapons in the game. And it's not like sub-weapons in Castlevania. If you get a weapon type, you're not stuck with it. You actively just technically add it to your inventory. By pressing select, you can change which of the 4 weapons you currently are using out of the 4 you totally can get. Given the amount of dinosaurs we've seen already, you're damn right the first boss fight's a T-Rex. Attack-wise, this guy's actually got quite a few for a first boss. He can charge across the screen, and when he puffs smoke out of his nose, that actually does damage you. He can puke out rocks and cavemen that can either roll along the bottom, or they can bounce up to the top if you're hanging out up here. And he can also just try to thwack you with his tail. He doesn't do that one too often, but it's worth noting all the same. Bosses especially suffer from getting their health increased on hard mode, which is the main reason I ultimately didn't do that difficulty, because again, I only really like to do higher difficulties for games if you only get the full ending by doing so, or something along those lines. And to my knowledge, at least in the Super Nintendo version, there is nothing like that that happens on higher difficulties. That's stage 1 down. So let's talk about the world map really quick, because there actually is a good amount to explain here. Red dots are actual stages. As you might figure, just like Mario 3 and other games that have this kind of map system, you cannot progress past the level until you've actively beaten it. Though you can re-enter stages you've already beaten to get extra score up, to grind for lives, anything like that. And you can even exit stages you're in midway through that if you've beaten them before by pressing start and then select, like some other games have done as well. The gray dots are continue tiles. Whenever you lose all your lives and have to use a continue, you're taken to the last one of those you touched, and the stages you've beaten up to that point are saved as long as you touched one since the last time you've beaten a stage, if memory serves. From memory, I think you have 3 continues, and they can each hold any amount of lives as long as you grind for them, because there are places you can actively grind for them. The green gates require the keys that you get from the little side areas the red eggs take you to in order to get past. However, there are more gates than there are keys, so you do need to be a bit choosy. I'm going out of my way, though, to unlock any that block off a blue tile. Blue tiles are mini-games, usually to either help you get some extra points, some extra 1-ups, heal up, all that jazz. They're nice to have, and you might as well get them along the way, especially considering this game is... I hesitate to say hard, but it's not easy or intermediate either. It's somewhere between the generalization of intermediate and hard, because bosses can still drain your health and resources if you're being very reckless against all their attacks, or if you're not taking every opportunity you can to heal or grind for lives along the way. As I said, continues are limited, so you can eventually just permanently lose. But it also, the Super Nintendo version is the easiest version of this game. Other versions have many more enemies. Bosses and enemies even also take more hits to begin with, like hard mode in this very version does. They're just rougher experiences compared to the Super Nintendo version. Also, since I haven't mentioned it yet, I have actually grabbed another weapon I haven't talked about yet, boomerangs. Boomerangs are the weapon you can spam the most, and they also have the highest range, but their damage is the lowest. For now, it's time for Audrey from Little Shop of Horrors. Yes, Audrey the III. This boss is kind of annoying that it can spawn some of the smaller version enemies we saw in the stage itself, while either whipping its vine forward to try to hit you or puking out a little bit of a spread shot of seeds. However, you can just roll through the boss at the start and stand here in the corner and it can literally never touch you. You can just drain its health however safely you feel and you're good. We're gonna say no to progress for a moment though, for 2 things in particular. For one thing, we can now access our first minigame stage. But for another, the start of stage 2 is the best place to grind out something else. For now, let's talk about this first minigame. There's 2 minigames of this variety in the game, where meat just falls from the sky. This is a good place to heal. Also in multiplayer, this is a good place to potentially compete for health, but I'll talk more about the multiplayer in a few moments. The big thing is, if you let any of the meat land on the ground and then disappear after a moment, you technically have failed this minigame, because at the top of all of these meats is a 1-up. If you let the 1-up land after you've grabbed every meat and then let the 1-up fade, 4 extra lives will spawn in its place, so you can get more lives by grabbing everything except the 1-up. But that said, the stage does fade out pretty quickly after that, so you actually need to do the roll forward rather than trying to just walk forward through them. So watch out for that. For now though, I'm going back into stage 2 because I actually want to farm out something. As I've said, there are multiple weapons in the game. The base club, the stone clubs you throw forward, the fire you throw forward, the boomerangs, but there's one other we haven't found yet, the stone wheel. And I'm grinding this egg over and over again, exiting the stage if I don't get it, until I actually do. The stone wheel is the best weapon in the game. It does the same damage as I think the strongest part of the fire attack, but it has a higher rate of fire. You can have 2 shots of this on screen, whereas the fire you can only have 1. And it's also a weapon that's great for horizontal levels, because the wheels actively do roll along the ground in the direction you're facing when you throw them. So you can throw them in straightaways and just kind of avoid any enemies in front of you, especially if you're good about spam firing it as you go. Right now, in this stage, though, I am going to swap over to something else because we got a bunch of bees here. These bees are good for grinding out score to begin with, but if you knock out, I think, the beehives in the order of middle, left, and right, a 1-up spawns on the top right of the screen right now. Stage 3 here isn't a lot to write home about. It's a bunch of leaves you can just jump around on and a couple of Neanderthals, but you can just ignore a lot of the level design and get through it really quickly. Now, like I mentioned a few moments ago, this game has multiplayer. Player 1's always Joe, player 2's always Mac, like I said earlier, I believe. But there's actively 2 different types of multiplayer in this. 2-player and Super 2-player. 2-player itself is what you'd expect. It's a co-op action platformer where you're both working together to get through the stage, but also competing for points along the way. Super two-player is that, but you can actively hit each other with your weapons to damage each other and knock each other out of the way. So it's the greedy time. For now, though, it's time for the Stage 3 boss. This is a giant... If it's a pterodactyl pteranodon, there's a difference between the two of those things, but I'm not exactly the dinosaur guy I used to be when I was very little, so I don't remember. It largely does sweeps across the screen, but it will also just slowly fly across. It can hit you with a bit of a wing wind attack to try to push you away from it, but it can also drop eggs that I believe will always spawn the tiny pterodactyls. If they don't sometimes spawn cavemen or meat in some cases. Now, something I should note when it comes to the weapons in the game, this is especially more so prevalent with the fire attack and the stone wheel. When you're actively attacking, you do throw the projectile out, yes, but your club attack still counts as a club attack. And what's annoying about that in some cases is that if you get too close to a boss fight, you'll hit them with the club, which will do less damage than, say, the stone wheel you're trying to throw out and hit them. So you need to kind of learn to keep your distance and really learn when to do a high jump versus just a normal jump in order to hit an enemy that's above you or things like that. So watch out and just kind of adapt to whatever the bosses are doing. Since the stages in this game don't have a time limit, you don't need to worry about a time over. So observe a boss's pattern, learn which jump might be better, and you're good. Some minigame spaces are actively more roulettes. They will have several eggs around you, you hit one, and it'll drop an item. What that item is random, though I'm not certain if it's one of those cases where the item is set the moment you go into the minigame, and thus any of them will drop that one item in particular. Stage 4 is an active auto-scroller, and it's technically the only one like this in the game. I want to say falling into the water counts as a bottomless pit, but I don't think I've ever actually died in this stage to the water. Because the platforming here, there's only really one jump that's really nasty, and even then if you use the high jump at the very last second, you can get over pretty quickly. Joe and Mac in this game, there is a slight sluggishness to them, I won't lie. But their jump arc is really good about getting around stuff. If anything, the only really rough platforming known in this game to me is sometimes the hitbox of things like spikes is a little weird. And on one tile / two tile platforms, where the hitbox of the platform is a little hard to judge, but on wider platforms than that, you're completely fine, in my experience. If there's something I do want to say though, make sure when you're going for a red pterodactyl, because there's another one coming up right here, make sure not only every enemy on the screen is dead, also make sure it's closer to the center of the screen and that any enemy corpses are also vanished, because I feel like those also will factor into whether or not you get the purple pterodactyl or just a random item drop out of them. And you want to get the keys because sometimes towards the end game, a checkpoint tile is hidden behind one of the gates the keys can open. And just to save some time and frustration, those are really worth grabbing. Also, hey, 1-ups are nice to have. Speaking of 1-ups though, in the case you're looking to grind for lives, in the case you're having trouble towards the end game or something like that on the Super Nintendo version, there are 2 stages I would recommend. One of them is the last normal stage before the end game stage, and I'll talk more about that in specific when we get there. But the other is actually the previous stage we were just in. Namely, the 1-up that the beehive spawn when you destroy them. That will spawn in any time you play through that level. So if you go into the level, grab it, then press start and select to leave and re-enter it, that 1-up is back there again, so you can just get that to get life after life after life. It's a bit slow, but if you're having trouble, I can easily recommend it. For now, it's time for us to go into the boss of Stage 4, which I actually had to look the name of up, because a lot of these, again, are dinosaurs I don't remember the name of. These are ichthyosaurs in specific. They start by spawning on the sides and then heading towards the center to try and hit you. After that, they just start hopping up and down throughout the water, throughout the entire area. They are pretty fast, though, so this is a case where I would actually recommend using the sprint option if you're trying to dodge rather than trying to roll by double tapping the D-pad. Because if you roll when there's more than one on screen, you might roll past and through one directly into another. The sprint by using the shoulder buttons at least allows you a little more speed for your control to still be active, which I like for this case. And there they go. There's only really 2, technically 3 bosses in the game I consider hard. One of those is because it just takes a while because of the amount of health. But the other 2 are because they are large and have a lot of health. Alright, stage 5 here's another very short one, and it's technically an auto-scroller again now that I think about it. It's a descending level where we're being held by this pterodactyl as we descend. There are rocks falling from the ceiling. I recommend staying towards the bottom left quarter of the screen just about. because that'll give you plenty of time to dodge anything coming from above you, while also just allowing yourself to stay towards one side to avoid anything, period. And we're already at the boss fight. Again, this stage is very short. I believe this boss is an elasmosaur? The main thing you need to hit on this boss, as with the T-Rex we saw earlier, is the head. Most of the bosses in this game are weak at the head. The big thing with it is that if you have projectile-based weapons, any of them, and you fire them into its mouth, it can actively swallow them and then spit them back out at you, though it mostly goes at an angle or straight ahead. So if you're just below where the mouth is, you can completely dodge that. It can charge across the screen, and I think the next attack it does in order after that is always to come out towards one of the opposite corners and spit out some of the fish from the previous stage at you. This boss isn't hard, but if you're very slow, I think you are guaranteed to do 2 or more cycles. I think I've seen someone beat this one in 1 cycle, but I've never done that myself. Not too hard, all the same. Now, I'm trying to remember exactly my experience with Joe and Mac, because this is one of those games I've always been very aware of, and I actually took a moment there between a recording burst to actually look around my room to see if I could find the book in question I'm about to talk about. But there was this Nintendo Power-esque book we had growing up that had, like, just secrets for some games and little guides for some stages. I know Joe and Mac was in there. I think Super Ghouls and Ghosts was. I think there was something from Mario World. But I remember distinctly, because this is also the book I found out about Zardion through, which that's a game I covered years ago at this point. I think it's at my brother's place, though, so I've texted him to ask if he can find the book and give me a screenshot so I can look into what exactly that book had to say about this game. I'll find out about that between parts, I suppose. Speaking of ice, though, time for the ice stage. You do slip and slide a little bit here, but not too much. The bigger annoyance in my case is actively some of the jumps are very tight, because if, say, you're in this little platform section, if you're on the top there, even if you do a short hop, you're likely to hit one of those pairs of spikes, so high jumping from the middle area is actually the best thing to do. And the collision with these spikes here is the one I was actually talking about earlier, because if you're just slightly further to the left there, you're gonna get hit. It's rough. Throw a stone wheel here, by the way, to counteract that caveman that's trying to surprise you. The game does that a lot, where it'll just sort of spawn things in a place you can't quite react to in time unless you already know they're going to be there, which is annoying, but it's very of the era, so I can't be too mad at the game specifically for doing that. Hell, Mega Man games did that a lot. So did Metroid 1. That one up, you're meant to use the Neanderthals to use as platforms. For now, it's time for the boss of this stage. It's an ice stage. So, of course, we're going back to the Ice Age with a woolly mammoth. This is another one of the contenders for hardest boss in the game. The only safe place, really, is on the far left side, but its main attack early on, outside of just dashing across the screen back and forth, is to fire a rock from its trunk that you can actively destroy. The fire is very good for that, because it can destroy it in one shot, so can the stone wheel. It's just that the stone wheel is a little more likely to go below it. It can stomp on the ground to make rocks rain from the ceiling as well, but those fall at such set intervals across the screen that's pretty easy to dodge. If you're very reckless, this can be rough, but this is also where I get to talk about this game's life system is very generous. This isn't one of those where you die and you're sent back to a checkpoint at the beginning of the stage. You just get the usual, like, funeral march with Joe and Mac's ghost, and you can land on the ground to end it early, and you can just spawn right back where you were. This is very in-the-moment, action-based platforming for the boss fights in that regard, and I'm actually very glad the game is that generous. Also, it's probably the only boss I actively feel bad for, because it's one of the only bosses in the game that actually has deterioration, because you straight up take off that thing's tusks and trunk, and that's just rough. Ugh. For now, it's time for the next stage, which is actually similar to stage 3. It's a largely vertical stage that's also very short. The thing to note about the boulders, you can destroy them, like I said, during the mammoth fight. You can just attack them and they'll break. But large boulders, they can also be destroyed. They just have more HP, and when you break them, they break down into, I think, 2 of the smaller boulders. So watch out for that. And the boss of this stage is a little familiar. It's time for another pterodactyl. This one's red, and I think it just does more damage or is more aggressive. There's not many differences. On my first playthrough, I thought this fight was a little more dangerous because I thought you actively couldn't stand off to the right, because I've seen plenty of games that have a little overhang like that, and that counts as a bottomless pit in some of them. But no, you're good to stand over there. The big thing at this point is just pacing your firing right to make sure you're getting as much damage in as you can without wasting too many shots. Speaking of which, I should mention, I've already mentioned that the fire and the stone wheel are the strongest weapons. The weakest weapon by far is the boomerang, but it makes up for it by having the highest rapid fire on top of the highest range. There's still boss fights, you're going to want to use that even over the fire or the stone wheel because you want to stay at a further distance away from whatever you're fighting in that case. I'd say on the whole, this is the last of the game's easier stages. Moving forward is where things start to get a little more chaotic, to say the least. On top of there being a little more bottomless pits. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the Super Nintendo version is the easiest version of the game, and that's because the Genesis version is by and large a more faithful port to the arcade version, because there are some mechanical differences even, on top of a different final boss and all that jazz. I'll probably do the Genesis version at some point, just because it's so radically different. On top of that, it'll allow me to kind of better bridge into Joe and Mac 2, because to my memory, Joe and Mac 2 on Super Nintendo is closer to the arcade and Genesis versions in terms of how it plays a little bit, namely with how much more action-intense some of the stages get to be. So this level's major mechanic is platforms that rise and fall. The bottomless pits below them are bottomless, but by and large, these platforms rise and fall at such a rate compared to the ones around them where there's always one that's safe to jump to very easily, especially with the somersault jump by pressing up and jumping. So you're completely safe for here, it feels like. Also, I forget if I mentioned it outright. I think I mentioned that the side roll gives you invincibility frames, but the upward somersault, I believe, also does. There's just only really one stage for me where that really comes in handy, though. This is probably the hardest egg to get in the game, barring maybe the one after this, because these little dinosaurs are surprisingly hardy and annoying. Because I've had several times where I'm trying to get the purple pterodactyls out of these red eggs. And especially with this egg here, I've had several times where I try to hit those tiny dinosaurs, I completely miss, and I hit the egg ahead of time. In that regard, actually, using a shorter range weapon is really good if you're trying to get the eggs, as that prevents you from hitting the egg accidentally, but even then you need to be careful about where your club is actually swinging, because it's very easy to overestimate your own range. And that's another key down. What is kind of interesting, though, is that this is one of those games where, especially on a first playthrough, you don't really notice the length of the stages, but on repeat playthroughs, you start to go, oh wow, even for a game of this general genre, these stages are very short. Also, I don't know how you're meant to get some of the meat in this game that's next to the campfires, because the campfires actively do damage you. I'm not sure if there's a way to destroy them, I've just completely forgotten about or not, so I just take the hit and go for a bit of a Pyrrhic recovery where I'll recover more damage than I'll take. With that, though, we're coming up on the boss fight for this stage, and it's actually one of the 3 instances in this LP I'm going to be speeding up the footage just to keep a pace going. Because there's 3 bosses in particular in this game that take forever, and this is the first one of them, a giant T-Rex. It has about the same attacks the original one has. It'll puke out rocks, kind of bob its head up and down and all that. Hitting it in the face is the weak point. I recommend standing just about where the nose is to easily avoid any dash downs it does like that. What's annoying about this particular fight is that this fight and one other are hard-coded to take the minimum amount of damage from any attacks you hit them with, even the stone wheel, so it'll be the same strength as your basic club attack. In that regard, you could use the boomerang here to good effect just to get more hits in more quickly. The only reason I'm sticking with the stone wheel in this case is that there is, I think it's technically an oversight or an animation thing, where the moment it flinches back from taking damage, it like screams upward like that with its eyes all bugging out. If you hit it at a very specific point, it does take the intended damage that the stone wheel has. So it'll take like the 2 or 3 damage it does versus the club's basic 1. I think I had it happen at least once in that fight, so if you can get that to happen, good. If you don't worry. That fight can be rough all the same. 2 other fights are going to be doing that in, and one of them has it for the exact same circumstances. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 2, we're going to go finish off the game. See you guys then.